So I want to thank you all for coming and picking me first. I appreciate that. It feels like I'm like the first kid picked on the kickball team at grade school. It's fantastic. I was never that kid. We'll take it. So I wanted to talk today about an issue that's very important because we hear several myths about the Constitution all the time, and I think this is one of the most prevalent. Government does not require a written constitution as a prerequisite to its own existence. And that can be stated categorically. In fact, governments of man throughout history existed without a constitution. There is one simple purpose for a written constitution, and that is to constrain government to a certain specific subset of guidelines. The reservoir of remaining powers can never be approached whatsoever. So that's what I want to talk about today. For instance, in the case of Britain, even a multi-branch government that's composed roughly the same way that ours is, didn't require a written constitution. Britain had an executive. He was called the king. It had a legislature. It was the parliament. It had courts. They were the royal courts. So despite that, the government didn't require a written constitution. And if you ask a Briton today, what's your constitution? They will recognize their constitution as being a series of traditions, court cases, and some written documents, but not a definitive, succinct written document, much like our United States Constitution that was ratified by the requisite amount of states in 1788 and put into place in 1789. So the myth that we most predominantly hear about the Constitution is, it's a living document, right? Can I get a show of hands of you? Who has heard that argument raised, whether it be in media, school, wherever? All right, so I'm one of them, right? That is the narrative that I got when I grew up, right? So I wanted to talk about that. I mean, people will sometimes raise that as if it was a pro for the Constitution. Like, this Constitution is great. It can be changed to suit whatever needs we want. Well, I'm sorry, but that negates the reason for which we have a written Constitution. It would be just ridiculous if we held government to certain specific enumerated powers if it can just entertain all other powers on a whimsical notion, all right? So today I wanted to talk about 3 specific clauses that people use to justify this lie, sometimes called elastic clauses. In fact, Patrick Henry called them sweeping clauses. Patrick Henry, the Lion of Liberty from Virginia, thought that they could be used by the government to assume all sorts of powers that were never enumerated. He said that, this Constitution, we have to oppose it because it's going to give the government way too much power, much more power than the Articles of Confederation. So that's what I want to talk about today, specifically the General Welfare Clause, the Commerce Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause. Those are 3 clauses that government constantly uses as justification to do just about anything. So first of all, the General Welfare Clause. General welfare appears in the preamble of the Constitution. The preamble of the Constitution does not delegate powers to any authority. It's a summative statement that lists the reasons for which the rest of the document was written. That being said, general welfare also appears in Article 1, Section 8. So the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Well, great. The problem is, the guy that introduced this clause in the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 said that it had limited powers. It didn't give the ability to government to do whatever it wanted. The guy's name was Roger Sherman of Connecticut. And those that know me know I'm a huge fan of Roger Sherman. Basically, there's no one that I revere more in the founding generation than him and Thomas Jefferson. So he introduced this in Philadelphia, and he said this when describing what the prose meant. He said, the objects of the Union were few. First, defense against foreign danger. Second, defense against internal disputes and a resort to force. Thirdly, treaties with foreign nations. Fourthly, regulating foreign commerce and drawing revenue from it. All other matters, civil and criminal, would be much better in the hands of the states. And we have to enunciate that sometimes. You have to hold government officials to those boundaries, those confines. Madison agreed. Madison wrote in Federalist 45 that the powers delegated to the general government would be, quote, few and defined, whereas the powers that would be left to the states would be numerous and indefinite. Read Federalist 45 sometime, it's an important one. Alexander Hamilton agreed too. Alexander Hamilton, the person who wanted the most power in government, agreed. Yeah, wait. Alexander Hamilton agreed. Madison said the same thing in Federalist 45. And Madison held that belief throughout the entirety of his life, even by the time of 1792, when he was a congressman. What happened was there was a cod fishery bill, and a cod fisher wanted subsidies. Where have we seen this before? Some things are tried and true throughout human history, right? Well, Madison held to that belief. He said, I, sir, have always conceived, I believe those who first proposed the Constitution conceived, it is still more fully known and more material to observe that those who ratified the Constitution conceived that this is not an indefinite government deriving its powers from the general terms prefixed to specified powers, but a limited government tied down to the specified powers, which explain and define the general terms. So Madison was saying that the reason that prose even exists is just to say that these powers are deemed convenient for the states to delegate to another authority, not to give, by the way, to delegate, just to lend, right? So George Nicholas of Virginia wrote the same thing. He said the General Welfare Clause only enables them, basically Congress, to carry into execution the powers given to them, but gives them no additional power. All right, so sometimes today we see federal employees justify things like Obamacare by saying that it's in the general welfare of the people that everyone has health care. But really, we know, as patriots, I'm sure, that the reality is it's the federal government that's forcing us to buy a product which we may or may not want. And that, by the way, was in the founders' time considered abominable and the reason for the Boston Tea Party. But I digress. We can talk about that another time. All right, so some people use that as justification. Some people don't even do that. All right, here we go. All right, now I can move. So when asked what in the Constitution gives the authority to institute the health insurance mandate, Nancy Pelosi, the speaker at the time, said, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" with a smirk on her face, and she laughed, all right? I cannot tell you how irate this made me when I first saw this, by the way. It's so characteristic of the mentality that we get out of Washington, where these people literally have disdain for the Constitution. It's not just that they don't know the Constitution and its pros, they spit on it. It's abominable, it's treacherous, it's tyrannical, and that's what we need to oppose. The Commerce Clause is another case in which the government uses as justification, usually to inhibit free trade or suppress trade. However, the truth of the ratification of the Commerce Clause was much different than that type of definition. The Commerce Clause says to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. That was a duty for Congress in Article 1, Section 8. Now, the Founding Fathers had good reason to put in the Commerce Clause into the Constitution. And to start out, the term regulate, by the way, in Black's Law Dictionary, which is the most cited legal dictionary in the history of the world, and today you find it cited in papers all over in law school, defines the term regulate as to make regular, and it did at that time. But we've since kind of twisted and morphed that terminology to mean suppress, but that's not what the founders wanted. In fact, several of the state ratifying ordinances say that we believe this text in particular will impede the notion of protectionist tariffs, fiat currency, and impediments to trade irregularities that emerged during the critical period. Critical period is when the Articles of Confederation were in place, from 1781 to 1789. And the two biggest things that happened at that time is protectionist tariffs were enacted against states. So states that were hostile to each other made it more expensive and less beneficial to trade with each other. In addition, they printed bills of credit on paper, known as fiat currency. Fiat is a currency that's not tied to a precious commodity like gold and silver. And this was happenstance for disaster, because just as we've known in other situations like the Weimar Republic Germany or Japan, Chile, where this currency gets inflated beyond control. That's what happened to the Continentals and the state bills of credit. In fact, the Continentals were essentially worthless by 1781. They were so worthless that that's where the phrase, not worth a continental, comes from. Has anyone heard that? Not worth a continental?
Only from you.
All right. Well, hopefully I'm not regurgitating too much. So Benjamin Franklin recognized the potential for fiat to be a disaster, by the way, during the Revolutionary War. The Commerce Clause is now present to remove impediments, irregularities, and really regulations on commerce, rather than to act as a suppressive force. But you'll see that the government has used this for treacherous causes. And I want to point to the most abominable in my estimation, because of all of the Supreme Court decisions that have ever occurred throughout US history, I believe the next is certainly in the top 3. And that's the case of Wickard versus Filburn, I'm sorry. Hopefully this changes. There we go. And that's the guy right there, Roscoe Filburn, 1942 Supreme Court case. I believe that Hugo Black was the Supreme Court justice at this time. And what happened was, this was an Ohio wheat farmer that, during times of depression, decided to grow a surplus of wheat for his own consumption with his family. So, because he did that, the court intervened and said, "What you are doing, Mr. Filburn, is unconstitutional." And he said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, I'm just growing a surplus of wheat for myself and my family. Well, what happened was the federal government was claiming that as an alternative to buying wheat on the free market, he decided to grow it. Therefore, it made him subject to regulation under the Commerce Clause. So this guy was ordered not to be able to grow wheat for himself and his family. It's just crazy. But, you know, and that was 70 years ago. We've seen where this has come now. People have used the Commerce Clause to justify all sorts of stuff. Like in the case of Gonzalez versus Raich in 2005. Even if you don't happen to agree with, legalization of marijuana, the Supreme Court steps in and tells California that you can't decide those things for yourselves. You can't decide to remain by the tenets of the 10th Amendment. You can't grow your own crop, consume it yourself. That's not even transporting it through different states, all right? So you see that all the time. The last one I want to talk about is the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution. This clause says the Congress shall have the power, and I'm going to enunciate here, by the way, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. All right, that's the most important part, because even as early as 1791, when Alexander Hamilton wanted to support a national bank in the United States, he claimed that this terminology was basically creating implied powers, what he called implied powers in his written constitutional opinion to George Washington at the time, when Washington was unsure, is this constitutional or not? Hamilton said, yeah, sure, this is constitutional. This clause gives the government the power to do this. It's an implied power, necessary and proper clause. But just 3 years earlier, here was what Hamilton said when talking about the necessary and proper clause. They're only declaratory of the truth which would have resulted by necessary and unavoidable implication from the very act of constituting a federal government, and vesting it with certain specified powers. This is so clear a proposition that moderation itself can scarcely listen to the railings which have been so copiously vented against this part of the plan, without emotions that disturb its equanimity. So what Hamilton was saying, Patrick Henry, he doesn't have a point. The Brutus writer doesn't have a point. That was a famous anti-federalist writing series. John Lansing doesn't have a point. Luther Martin doesn't have a point. This doesn't grant any new powers. Well, we can see that as early as 3 years later, some politicians, including Hamilton, kind of did a 180 on that. In Federalist 44, Madison said, without the substance of this power, the whole Constitution would be a dead letter. So what the necessary and proper clause actually did was just gave the government the ability to create incidental tasks that were necessary for carrying out the powers that were already listed. So for instance, the federal Constitution gives the ability to government to construct postal roads, by the way. I don't know if you guys are aware that that's in one of those listed powers. Well, Madison realized, to do this, the government has to procure pavement. It has to be able to hire the officials to do that. It didn't mean that it gave them new powers, just to carry into execution the foregoing powers. That's how the Constitution puts it. So Madison certainly agreed with Hamilton 3 years prior, not in 1791. Jefferson wrote the same thing in his opinion to Washington as a Secretary of State that constantly butted heads with Hamilton and said the same thing. He said the Constitution only means which are necessary and not those which are merely convenient. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but Jefferson concurred, and this was a powerful attack on Hamilton's propositions. So anti-federalists like George Mason and Patrick Henry that I just talked about cited this clause as being one that the government would take advantage of to create new implied powers, like Hamilton eventually said they did. I mean, if you look at some of these writings from Patrick Henry and George Mason, they actually look like prophets, because everything that they warned about came to fruition in the years just subsequent to ratification. But it was mostly because of runaway government policy, not because of the Constitution. And Patrick Henry said that this clause would lead to limitless federal power that would inevitably menace individual liberty. So if the necessary and proper clause meant what some say, then as I kind of hinted at earlier, the enumeration of specific powers would be abnegated and absurd. It'd be, superfluous. It doesn't make any sense why you'd want a constitution that specified powers, but oh wait, here's this prose, you can do whatever else you want also. It renders a constitution that's written and confined to certain boundaries completely irrelevant, and really there's no necessity of having a written constitution. As I pointed out, that's the reason we have a constitution. Too much power consolidation in the center is a menace to liberty, and the founders really understood that. Even the ones that attacked the Constitution understood that. Let's go to the next slide here. Just some brief thoughts. A government that can do what it wishes doesn't need confines of a written constitution. And a living document model would make specific enumerated powers irrelevant, like I've hinted at. So, given all these transgressions, this is something that has really made me actually quite disgruntled at times. If I think about this too much, to be honest, I have a hard time sleeping. I'm not kidding about that, because some of what we go through in life is so far removed from the founders' dreams, the dreams that they shed blood for, that our patriot brothers and sisters fought and died for in many cases. Nathan Hale got executed for it. Crispus Attucks did the same thing when he intervened in the Boston Massacre, which, by the way, had its anniversary yesterday. So we need to understand that. So how do we fight back? What can we do? That's the question that's asked to me all the time, and it should be asked to anyone. There's multiple theories on what to do. And what is our last hope? What do we do to convince these government officials that are in power to hold to the confines of the Constitution? I don't know about you, but I've written my federal legislators sometimes and raised a particular concern, usually on the Constitution. And sometimes, I get like a snarky attitude from that clerk that's working for the politician. Sometimes not. Sometimes they're kind enough to send me a template that doesn't address the original concern I emailed them. All right. Yes, nice hearing from you. They always say that. We love to hear from you. Right? If you love to hear from me, I think you'd hold by the confines of the Constitution. So when this is asked to me, I answer by saying that I side with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in saying, when it comes to federal usurpation of power, quote, nullification is the rightful remedy. James Madison said that interposition, and in effect nullification of unconstitutional federal law, was necessary for arresting the progress of evil. That's pretty strong condemnation of unconstitutional authority, but we could use those mentalities today. And I want to talk a little bit about nullification, how it emerged to round out my session here, and how it's been employed and how it can be employed today. All right? So the background of nullification is that because the government has passed unconstitutional law, the states as parties to the compact, which means a multi-body contract to the Constitution, have to exert some sort of influence or obstruction when its own instrument, namely the Constitution, perverts itself, when federal officials pervert the Constitution. So to do that, we have to allow the states to determine, as members of the compact, to determine that the federal government has gone far beyond the bounds of its own authority. And this was famously done by Jefferson and Madison in 1798. In 1798, perhaps the most egregious law in US history was passed. It literally caused these people, particularly James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, to believe that our republic was going to be a short-lived 8-year republic, one that would be soon replaced by a monarchy. In fact, Thomas Jefferson likened this time in a letter to John Taylor of Caroline to that of a reign of witches. All right? You know what? I really wish politicians would speak like this. I just think it's so poetic. I love even saying it. So. But what happened was the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed. And the Alien and Sedition Acts were a series of 4 acts, the most controversial of which was the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act made it a criminal offense, a federal offense for which people were prosecuted for levying a common criticism against the president, members of Congress, and civil officers of the United States, including Supreme Court justices and things like that. So for making a benign, harmless criticism that we would hear every day today on talk radio, these people could be incriminated for as much as 2 years in jail and pay as much as $2,000 to the federal government. Rush Limbaugh could not exist. Mark Levin could not exist. And that's not particularly endorsement to either of those individuals, but that's the same thing. When a Republican is in power, you can criticize a Republican. I don't care about party. But that is abominable, and Jefferson saw through that. He saw that this does not belong in a Republican form of government. So here's what Jefferson did. He got together with James Madison at Monticello and crafted what would become known as the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions of 1798. And sometimes the ideas found in these documents are referred to as the Principles of 98. And this is fantastic. If you guys ever have a chance to read these documents, please do. They are masterful works of art that are some of the best constitutional writings that I could ever recommend. And Jefferson said, and I'll tell you why they're named the Kentucky and Virginia Resolutions in a second. But Jefferson said that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated authorities, its actions are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. So what he was doing is he was constructing legislation to introduce to Kentucky to adopt for their own state, which rendered the Sedition Act unconstitutional and unenforceable within its own boundaries. And that happened also in Virginia, where Madison's counterpart, that I'll talk about in a second, got adopted. So basically, from the time that this happened, there were 25 people tried under the Sedition Act and 10 convictions. I'd like to read to you about some things that these guys got convicted of to show you just the absurdities involved. A guy named Luther Baldwin was a guy from Newark, New Jersey that was going to celebrate, well, not celebrate, actually he was a town drunkard, right? And there was going to be a cannon procession because the president at that time, John Adams, happened to go to Newark, New Jersey. And when he did, cannons followed him. And they say that Luther Baldwin stumbled out of the bar that he was drinking at and said, "I wish they'd fire cannons through John Adams' ass." I mean, what a harmless thing to say, but for that, he was jailed and fined $2,000 and jailed until he could pay his fines. A guy named David Brown made a sign that said, "No Stamp Act, no Sedition Act, no alien bills, no land tax, downfall to the tyrants of America, peace and retirement to the president, long live the vice president." The president was John Adams, the vice president was Thomas Jefferson. For that, he was jailed 18 months with a $4,000 bail. All right? And here's the last one. In the most comical situation, I think, is, going backwards here. The most comical situation of all of them is at the bottom. Matthew Lyon was a guy from Vermont who, while being convicted of the Sedition Act, basically this is what he said about Adams, that Adams had an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and selfish avarice. I love this terminology. I would have said the same thing about Adams, by the way. I echo on Senate. sentiments. I mean, Adams fought for the cause of independence, but not a great president, in my estimation. But for that, he was jailed, and there was a rallying call to this guy. He actually won a seat to the 6th Congress while imprisoned. And this rallied huge support against the Alien and Sedition Act. So when Thomas Jefferson and James Madison wrote these legislations and they were adopted in their states, that was a powerful barrier against federal usurpation of power. Like I said, Jefferson called this a reign of witches. Nullification shows how unconstitutional action can be dealt with, and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson did that. So I told you a little bit about what Jefferson said. I love this prose, it's some of my favorites. Jefferson completely condemned the acts, and Madison did as well. So we can see that he wrote to interpose for arresting the progress of evil. Namely, Virginia wasn't going to enforce this. Well, because of that, Thomas Jefferson actually arguably won the presidency. In 1800, as part of the Jeffersonian Revolution, he was actually tied in the Electoral College, but the House of Representatives picks the president in that case, and after a series of ballots, he eventually won. So he allowed the Alien and Sedition Acts to expire. The Republican Congress, indeed, at the same time. His party or faction was called the Republican faction. Now, I want to explain a little bit more about nullification. It's used today, but what exactly is it? What are its boundaries? Nullification is not a state rendering null any law it doesn't want. It's only rendering null unconstitutional law that is against the original axioms, truisms, and tenets of the Constitution. It's not something a state can just pragmatically say, well, if you want to build postal roads, you can't do it in our state. It's only for unconstitutional laws.
It's kind of like these sheriffs, they've been saying, we're not going to enforce these gun laws. Wait, you know, that's what you're
And we'll hear from one later, right?
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Local officials have to stand up to usurpations, and a lot of it is products of individuals. Now, an unconstitutional is null. It's not enforced in the states. In fact, some of the legislation has pros to make it so state officials cannot even assist the federal marshals or officials in prosecuting people. That happened in those cases. And the big thing is nullification didn't start with the South Carolina nullification crisis of 1832, which is sometimes the only reference point in textbooks when it comes to nullification. I'd really be interested, before you came here today, and please don't be ashamed, because I was one, who has heard of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1790? Can I get a show of hands? Okay. Great. I mean, I'm emphatic to expose you guys to this stuff. It's powerful stuff. How is nullification used? Okay. Massachusetts and Connecticut in particular used it to prevent embargoes. During Jefferson's presidency, the Embargo Act of 1806, I believe, was probably the lowest point of Jefferson's presidency. As a big Jefferson fan, I have to admit, this is his worst policy, right? This suppressed commerce and kind of abided by Napoleon's continental system, so no commerce could go out of Massachusetts and Connecticut. And here, these states that actually opposed the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions 9 years later or something, about 9 years later, are basically saying, hey, principles of 98, nullification, we can use this stuff, we're not going to allow the enforcement of this. Principles of 98, Thomas Jefferson said it himself, you know. It's been used to prevent conscription of minors in the War of 1812, because for a while during Madison's presidency, actually, they entertained the notion of conscripting minors without the consent of parents in the War of 1812. So basically, they said that no, we won't allow this is unconstitutional. And the Constitution doesn't allow for conscription to begin with. So phooey with your unconstitutional laws. Well, that wasn't fully employed, but they stood up. The most powerful thing is the northern states lined up en masse to nullify the fugitive slave laws of 1850. The fugitive slave law of 1850 was basically part of the Compromise of 1850. This made it so that runaway slaves could be delivered up on the basis of hearsay by their masters by federal officials. And if you didn't do that as a citizen or a state official, you could be jailed and fined. You had to assist people on the basis of lofty, whimsical claims that this is my slave. And they didn't respect habeas corpus rights at all. So, for instance, Vermont said that's hogwash. We are going to make it a crime in our state for you to follow the federal government and enforcing this. Michigan rose up and said, you can't use our jails to hold these people. This is unconstitutional. Wisconsin is one of the most famous cases. A runaway slave named Joshua Glover was freed by an incredibly resentful man that was full of ire toward this policy. His name was Sherman Booth. He freed Joshua Glover and made it so his liberty could not be seized. That's how nullification has been used. It's not to protect slavery. And that's the narrative, unfortunately, some people get. It flies against the historical case of it. Today, nullification is used by several states to oppose drone strikes, to resist national standards like the Real ID Act, that national ID card. It renders acts that ban certain substances unenforceable, regarding the 10th Amendment as being what it actually says, that these powers aren't the federal government's. Our localities can decide such things. The most powerful way I think that nullification is being used today is in two areas. In Florida, Missouri, and Arizona, bills are invoking the actual language from the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions to abhor and render null any past, future, and present firearm ownership limitations by the federal government. And those efforts are incredible. The second way, and this is my favorite because this is just ingenious, and this is something that I'm writing for in the 10th Amendment Center online, is that bills in Utah, Tennessee, and Maryland would literally cut off power and resources to the NSA facilities in those states that are engaging in spying. So literally water would be turned off to these places as long as they continue to violate the Fourth Amendment. So that's basically where I'll end, but like Thomas Jefferson said, we can actualize this. This is the rightful remedy. The last thing I'll say is that I want you guys as patriots to be able to produce a bulwark, that powerful shield of liberty against federal tyranny when they approach your state with a sword of force. And I'd love for you guys to teach this stuff to others, tell others these messages. That being said, I'd love to reference you guys to my website, my Twitter account. I write articles for the 10th Amendment Center. I have one up there right now on the main page, which deals a little bit with the topics today. And I'd love to hear your comments afterwards. I'm going to stay afterward. I'd love to talk to you guys about the Constitution. Thank you guys for all your courtesy, everything you do in the movement, and for spreading what Samuel Adams said was brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. Thank you guys.